Okay, I propose to start. So welcome to this FNS workshop. It's great to have you here with us. So I would like to start with a few technical points. So we will use a Zoom to transmit the talks in direct, but we will also upload some of the talks, not all the talks, but some of the talks, we will upload them on YouTube so that people in who are living in countries that are not in a good time zone, they can listen to the talks afterwards. And I would like also to say that on Thursday, there is a virtual poster session. So we experienced different virtual poster sessions in the last months, and they are really great. So it's like a computer game, you know. So you are working in this virtual world, you are seeing poster presenters, you are discussing with other attendees. So it's surprisingly similar to a real poster session, so in the real world. So we highly recommend you to join this poster session, this virtual poster session on Thursday. And I would like also to thank very much Merce Latorre for the fantastic support in the organization of the workshop. And I would like also to thank the financial support of the University of Hong Kong and ICFO. And with this, I would like to ask Eva Weik to be the chairwoman of the first session. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Adrian. Welcome everyone from my side as well. I'm Eva Weik from the Technical University of Munich, formerly University of Constance. And before I start the first session, I see that we have a first raised hand. So maybe I test if this works. So is there a first question? No, maybe this was a false alarm. So let's proceed with the session. So this is the first session of our virtual FNS. We have 3 talks this afternoon. Every talk is 30 minutes, which will be followed by 10 minutes of discussions. If you have a question you would like to ask, please use either this raising hand feature, which just didn't work, or type your question in the chat, and then we will take your questions if time permits. Yeah, and I think this is it for the technicalities. It's my pleasure to start the first session. Our first speaker is Audrey Bienfait from the INS Lyon, and she's going to start with some talk about quantum nanomechanics.
Right. Can you all see my talk?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet, we hear you.
All right, let me try again. Does this work?
It is coming, yeah?
All right, okay, perfect. All right, so first, well, I would like to thank the organizer for giving me the opportunity to participate to this workshop. It's very much a pleasure to be on this webinar with all of you. Even if now I'm at École Normale Supérieure de Lyon, I'm going to present actually what I did during my postdoc at University of Chicago in the group of Andrew Killen. And this is about realizing quantum communication and interferometry experiment using surface acoustic wave phonons. So maybe first I will motivate why we would like to do that before diving into the technical details. Oh, and yeah, I forgot to say, but if you have any questions, do not hesitate to interrupt. I'm very happy to answer during the talk. What can we do with quantum flying phonons? Why are we interested in these phonons? We can try to answer this question by trying to make an analogy with flying photons. And these photons have been used for quantum information processing, for example. They have been used to carry quantum information, for example, in these I'm going to, I would like to have a pointer. I don't know how to do that. Oh, yes. Yes, sorry. With this Bell inequality violation test realized a few years ago at TU Delft. And maybe one more example of what we could do with them is interferometric experiment. And what can come to mind immediately is the gravitational wave sensing of LIGO and Virgo. And so what I would like to convince you in this talk is that we can actually realize the same kind of experiment using phonons. So we can use them to carry quantum information, and we can also use them to perform interferometric experiment. And so for that, we have built an experimental device using superconducting qubits to detect and manipulate these phonons and carry out these tasks. And in this talk, in particular, I would like to show that we can go up to the point that where we can do fundamental tests for quantum mechanics and realize a quantum erasing experiment. So before delving into the technical details of the setup and how we can build such a phonon tool, I would like to detail a bit this quantum erasing. And for that, I have to come back to the early days of quantum mechanics, where we wondered what was the nature of photons, and we eventually came to the consensus that it was a dual picture. Photons were both waves and particles until they were measured. And that's really clear when you look at interferometers, such as a Mach-Zehnder interferometer, where you have a single photon source emitting photons that impinge on the beam splitter, so they can take either one path or the other. And when you try to recombine these two paths, depending on the phase buildup between the two paths, you can observe interferences. So that's similar to the Young double slit experiment. And really comes the fact that when the photon is crossing over the interferometer, the system is an entangled state in a superposition state. And so this evidence the wave nature of the photon when you see interferences. But you can also go to a particle nature if you were to remove the second beam splitter, because in this case, you would have the photon either clicking on the up or the down detector, and thus only making the interferences disappear when you average over many realizations of the experiment. Another way to collapse back to the particle nature of a photon is to acquire the Wedge path information by having a new devices measuring a particular path. And in this case, you also see the collapse of the interferences of the oscillation. And the question that is asked when you realize a quantum eraser test is it possible to erase this Wedge path information that you have gathered on the system and to recover the interferences? And so that's what was proposed by Maran Schooley and Klaus Druhl in 1982, and it's generally answered in a protocol that has 3 steps. The first step is to measure interference pattern. The second is to acquire the Wedge path information and see that the interferences disappear. And then to erase the Wedge path information and see that we can recover, that we can erase this action that we have done on the system to recover the interferences. So that's been done for using photons for 30 years now. And now we want to make this test using phonons. And so for this, we will come back to our setup where we are using superconducting qubits to manipulate this phonon. And now is the time to really go into the details and to look at the setup. So we are using for phonons surface acoustic waves. So those are, for those who are not familiar with that, those are relay waves. They are express the displacement of the surface on a distance that is approximately 1 wavelength. It has a very large linear wavefront that can extend over several tens of wavelengths. And one very particular feature of this wave is their very slow propagation speed, only a few kilometers per second. And so because of this low propagation speeds, they make very good filters, and so they have been used in many classical devices. And it's only now for a few tens of years that they've also gathered a lot of interest to build hybrid quantum phonon devices. So for example, they have been used to transfer electrons from one spot to the other between two distant quantum dots. They have also been used to drive and interact with electronic spins. And then the most attention for which they have been, the system for which they have been the most investigating is coupling with subunity qubits. And this is also using subunity qubits that we are going to manipulate them at the quantum level. So let's talk a little more about how we can generate and detect this surface acoustic wave. Well, you just require one interdigitated transducer on which you can apply a microwave signal. So this will create an oscillating electric potential between the fingers. And if you have deposited this IDT on a piezoelectrical material, this will also induce a displacement field and thus generate the surface acoustic wave. So this is completely reciprocal. If you have a surface acoustic wave impinging on the IDT, you will also generate an electrical potential that can be converted to a microwave signal. So this conversion process takes place at the frequency set by the periodicity of the fingers, and the selectivity is given by the number of pairs of fingers. And one very striking feature that's going to become important later on is the fact that at some frequency, very close to the main frequency peak, you have zero conversion from microwave to acoustic domain. So this is this IDT that we'll use to generate photon. And so we use lithium niobate as a piezoelectrical substrate. And then this main IDT will transduce phonons both left and right at a frequency of around 4 gigahertz. And then to build a close quantum communication channel to recover these phonons that we have emitted, we have placed 1 millimeter away on both sides of the IDT phonon reflectors. So those are just metallic strip lines that build up a reflection so that when the surface acoustic wave impinges on them, they bounce back towards the IDT. So now, using this device, we have the ability to send phonons and then recover them after a lapse of time of approximately 500 nanoseconds. And now we want to play with quantum phonon with single phonons one at a time. And for that, we are going to use a special brand of speakers and receivers. And those are these subunity qubits. That we are going to couple using a tunable coupler with which we can turn the coupling on and off. So I realize that not all of you are familiar with subunity qubits, so I will try to explain what they are and what we can do with them. So they are made of LC electrical circuit, so a capacitance in parallel with an inductance. So the inductance is made of two Josephson junctions in parallel with each other. So this build up a squid, so that when we build up a flux at the middle of the squid, we can tune this inductance and so have control over the frequency of the LC. And the second advantage of this Josephson junction is that it's nonlinear. So if we look at the oscillator formed by this inductor and capacitor, the typical parabolic potential will be deformed downwards to will be deformed, so that the usually evenly spaced transition can be addressed one by one. So we can make out of this eigenstate two quantum state that we can use as the basis to form the quantum bit. So here I label them just ground and excited state. So with this LC oscillator, nonlinear LC oscillator, we can implement this quantum bit. We can, so for those who are specialists, we are using the 2D kind of flavor with the X-mount shape for the capacitor. We realize them on a Sapphire chip. And we have different control line. So one of the control line allows us to read out what is the state of the quantum bit in a single shot manner. Another control line allows us to perform Rabi oscillation and to drive oscillation on the Bloch sphere. And then another line allows us to tune the inductance of the squid and thus modify the frequency of the superconducting qubits. And these superconducting qubits, that's how they are made. They can be used to manipulate a single photon, because with simple pulse around the Bloch sphere, it's possible to drive the system from the ground to its excited state, and then you have a single microwave photon that you can play with. So that's this microwave photon that we would like to transform into a flying phonon. From this, we need to couple it to the interdigitated transducer so as to emit the phonon inside our surface acoustic wave channel. And for that purpose, we are using a tunable coupler. So this is a RF squid that is inserted on the ground path of the qubit, so that the mode is grounded through two branches, one of them being coupled to the interdigitated transducer. And because we have a Josephson junction that is inserted inside this second branch, we can tune the amount of current that is flowing through this branch, meaning that we can turn the coupling to the IDT either on or completely off if we choose to the good value for the inductance here to completely make this branch inaccessible. So this geometry also enables us to use a flip chip geometry, where we have this mutual coupling realized over two chips. So the bottom chip is the Sapphire chip, which contains the superconducting qubits, which have very good performances when using this material. And the top chip is a lithium niobate chip and contains all the acoustic devices, the interdigitated transducer and the mirrors, and this is where we generate the phonons. So this flip chip geometry enables us to have the best of both worlds, having very good superconducting qubits and and access to the acoustic systems. And so this is what the chip look like in their entirety. Here you can see the Sapphire chip, which is 6 mm wide. We have two qubits with two couplers that couple to the IDT that you can see here, and that gives access to the SO channel that you can see here. And so the both chips are just glued together so that they face each other and are 5 microns apart. And so the first thing that we do is try to see if we can emit this phonon. So for this, we prepare the qubit in its excited state. We open the coupler for a time t, and we see what happens. And so that's what is shown here. The qubit frequency, we show the qubit frequency as a function of this coupling time t. And what we see is that at first, at the very small time t, we see that the qubit emits its photon very fast in approximately 8 nanoseconds at 3.95 gigahertz. And then we see that at some time, 500 nanoseconds, we see a re-excitation of the qubit. And so with this, we can conclude that we are actually coupled to the interdigitated transducer, that this very frequency-dependent transmission is given by the microwave response of the transducer, and that for some frequency, we are actually impinging on the Bragg mirror, reflecting the phonon that comes to re-excite the qubit after the round-trip time. So we can emit phonons, so that's more or less a proof of that. And now we are trying to capture them again. And there is a caveat to that, is that when you have a qubit on whatever system that is naturally emitting, it generates exponentially decaying envelope phonons or photons. And if you just reverse that and try to capture it again, because you have a finite coupling bandwidth for the qubit, you can only hope to capture 54% of this wave packet at best. And the trick to go to 100% capture efficiency is to modulate the decay rate. And because we have this tunable coupler, we can do that in situ. And when we pick up the good shape for this coupler, we go from an exponential decay to something that is smoothly varying, so that when the phonon comes back after propagating for 500 nanoseconds, we can capture it nearly in its entirety. And here we see you see that we only reach approximately 60%, and that's because of acoustic losses. So if we compute what is the quality factor of this device, we find that for propagation of 500 nanoseconds, we expect to recover 65%, and that's actually what we observe here. So that's all consistent. So we can prepare any kind of quantum state, either the excited state or superposition of excited plus ground state, release it, let the phonon propagate, and then capture it again. And we can make the tomography of this process. And we find when we decompose it on fundamental operation, that we have a fidelity of 82% compared to doing nothing, which is what this catch and receive transfer is about. So that's the first step towards quantum communication. So we can really use this phonon as carrier of quantum information. And now I would like to go toward this interferometry test that I've talked about in the beginning. So how do we build up an interferometer out of this device? So let's look at what happens if we only emit half of a phonon. So instead of opening fully the coupler during the emission time, we only modulate slightly, so that's only half of the qubit energy is released. So we go from excitation probability of 1 to 0.5 after this emission time. So if we do exactly the time reversal, the same things as for the capture, as for the emit and capture protocol is going to happen, we're going to capture again this half phonon propagating inside the channel, with the probability also below 1 because of the acoustic losses. But now what happens closely during this capture? So if you look at quantum input-output theory, it tells you that the wave that is reflected on the IDT during the capture process is actually the sum of two waves. One of them is the input field and acoustic field. So that's to say the half phonon reflecting on the back mirror and coming back to the IDT. And the second contribution is the qubit field. So that's to say the energy that has been stored in the qubit during this phonon propagation. And you can completely capture the half phonon only because there is a destructive interference taking place between these two contributions. So what happens now if we put some dephasing between these two contributions by building up a tuning pulse on the qubit? And if we arrange so that this detuning has a phase of pi, we see that actually we can turn this interference to a constructive interference, meaning that the reflected phonon will go back towards the phonon channel. And so the qubit should end up de-excited. And that's actually what we measure. When we apply this detuning pulse of pi with phase pi, we lose any excitation inside the qubit. And we can see interferences from the qubit being completely de-excited back to excited by varying this phase pi. So in a sense, this is an interferometer, and the two paths that made this interferometer is the energy being stored inside the qubit or the energy being in the phonon and traveling inside the channel. So on one side, our single phonon source is our qubit. The release protocol is our beam splitter. these two paths are either the qubit or the phonon channel, and then the capture is the second beam splitter. And we can only measure one of the two paths using the qubit. We can't actually detect what is left inside the acoustic channel. So let's try to make a quantum eraser test out of that. So we have a superposition state that describes the entanglement of the two paths. Either the qubit is excited or the phonon is emitted. And the first step towards making the quantum eraser test is to capture the which path information. That's to say whether the qubit is excited or the phonon has been emitted. And to build that, we need to know which path we are in without disturbing the interference process. And so for that, we are going to emit a second phonon only when the qubit is in E. So only for the path 1 and not for the path 2. And to do that, what we are going to do is use the third state of the superconducting qubit. So we are going to apply a selective pi pulse that is going to take the qubit when in E towards the state F. And then we are going to tune the qubit so that it's resonant, so that this EF transition is resonant with the main acoustic peak of the IDT, so that we emit a second phonon. And this will only occurs if the qubit is in E. If the qubit is in G, when the phonon has been emitted, so that corresponds to path 2, the first pi pulse do not apply, and we also do not have any emission because we are not resonant with the IDT. Right, so that's a reward that is going to enable us to determine through which path on which path we are and capture the which path information. So when we repeat the interferometric experiment, so this half freeze leave and half catch, and in the middle apply this Herald generation scheme, we see that as a result, we have localized the phonon on one of these two paths, and we can no longer observe any interferences. We have really a flat line. If we look at the oscillation, it's less than 1%. So that's the second step of the quantum eraser test. And now comes the last step, which is, can we erase this switch path information? Can we erase this action that we have done on the system and go back to a wave picture for the phonon? And for that, we need to remove this fingerprint that we have left on the system. So what we are going to do is capture the second phonon that we have generated using the second qubit that is in the system. And so we're going to end up in a state where we have on the first pass the qubit excited, no phonon being, no first phonon being traveling, and the qubit 2 excited, with superposed to a both qubit being de-excited. And now, just to erase this fingerprint that we have on qubit 2, knowing which path did we go through, we can just apply a power 2 on this qubit. So that will make qubit 2 being in a superposition of ground and excited state. And then when we measure qubit 2, it's no longer to know possible for us to know whether we were in the qubit being excited path or the qubit being the excited path. And if we do this experiment, we actually see that we recover interferences inside the system. So it's actually a bit more complex than that. So by applying this power 2 pulse on qubit 2, you actually create a 4-pass interference decomposed on qubit 1 being excited, qubit 2 being excited, the reverse, qubit 1 excited, qubit 2 de-excited. So that's from pass 1. That's interfere with these 2 other paths, which are qubit 1 being de-excited and qubit 2 either excited or de-excited. So if you were just to sum these two contribution 2 by 2, you will not see interference. But if you post-select on qubit 2 being excited, then you can recover these interferences. And that's because basically the action of determining whether qubit 1 was left excited during this interferometric experiment by generating the second phonon was erased by capturing it over qubit 2 and then basically canceling the fact that we could measure this phonon by applying this power to pulse. So that's basically the story. If I can summarize, I have shown you that we can emit and receive a single phonon using Sumington qubits. So those are great to generate a phonon entanglement. I've shown you that we can have 2 phonon entanglement. So this has enabled us to perform a quantum erasure test. And what we look forward to is try to go beyond just a closed single phonon channel and try to have emission from one node to the other. We're also working on improving the acoustic losses so we can have longer lived experiment. And then we hope to be able to do a much more complex quantum optic experiment, and why not try to build phonon counters to have a full phonon optics setup. And with that, I would like to thank all the people involved in this work. So this was done at the Cleland Lab at the University of Chicago under the direction of Andrew Cleland. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in, and I'm ready to take questions. Oh, I see there is already one. So the question is about how, when you couple the lithium niobate and the sapphire chip, how tolerant is the setup to misalignment? So that's basically given by the width of the inductor. We have a 10 micron wide inductor, so basically you can misalign everything by 10 micron and not lose more than 10% on the coupling.
Okay, so maybe first of all, we thought we should thank the speaker. This got somehow overlooked with this first very fast question. But are there more questions? Well, people are maybe looking for the raise hands button. Maybe I have a question about the fidelity. So what do you think is a viable path to increase that?
So the fidelity is really determined by the acoustic losses. And we have acoustic losses due to the, in a sense, acoustic impedance mismatch between the free space propagation region and the metallic covered region. So between these two kind of regions, the wave speed is not exactly the same, and so that creates mismatch that generate bulk wave, and we think it's likely that most of our acoustic losses come from this. And so the trick to have better fidelity would be to have a smoother transition from one region to the other, and try to cancel this impedance mismatch. But this is a lot of also simulation and material characterization to get everything well aligned. So that's kind of very tough to do.
Okay, I see a new question. Maybe do you want to read it?
Yes, so the question is, what is the effect of the additional secondary peaks in the IDT frequency response on the system as a whole? So for our experiment, these secondary peaks do not come into play. That's because the bandwidth of emission of the qubit through this tunable coupler is very much narrower than the emission peak of the IDT. There's maybe a factor 20 between them. So when we emit at a frequency, we emit near the main IDT peak, and so we do not send any kind of power through this secondary peak. But this complex structure with several peaks is useful when we do the quantum eraser test, because at some point when we're in the excited state for the qubit, we want to emit this second phonon to generate this herald, but we do not want to populate the ground state because that's the other pass, and we do not want this to pass to somehow overlap by generating this herald. So that's where we go to we place this EG transition, which we do not want to activate at all, at a zero emission point of the IDT. So that's a very important step that I maybe did not mention during the quantum eraser test protocol.
Okay. Now questions start trickling in. Maybe I start reading them and then you can answer. So the next question is, you mentioned built phonon counters as an outlook. Would that still rely on transferring the acoustic excitation to a qubit first?
We could have several options. So we can look at what is done in circuit quantum electrodynamics for microwave photons. So here now it's possible to transfer photons and then phonons for us to some kind of cavity and then count how many excitations there is in this cavity. So that would be one first step. But now you can also count itinerant photons without disturbing them, and that would be a great tool to have. So I think that's possible to do that. Yeah, so that's one question. The second one, you said that SORs are good filters due to their low propagation speed. Could you elaborate on that? Yes, so because they have a very low propagation speed, it's possible to be very selective in the time domain and to have very sharp feature, and that's why they are better than for example microwave filters. They also take a lot less space because of this very small propagation speed.
Okay, and I think we have one more question. Thank you very much for the nice talk. You use a Fabry-Perot cavity for the phonons. Could you discuss if you looked at the density of states and how this impacts your experiment?
I'm not quite sure what is meant by density of states, so I'm a bit fuzzy on how to answer this question. In a sense, this Fabry-Perot cavity, you have to think of it as a multi-mode phononic cavity. And so you have the density of state as given by the temperature for a bosonic mode. So there's not really any impacts for experiments. There is no freezing out of the acoustic, the acoustic degree of freedom as the temperature and frequency at which we operate are frozen out, but are very similar to microwave cavity, if that can be helpful. And the acoustic quality factor of these Fabry-Perot modes are approximately 20,000 to answer the last question.
Okay, so that directly targeted the last question. Also, we seem to have answered the previous question correctly because there is a thank you. I also wasn't quite sure about the meaning. And as long as I don't see any other immediate question, I think it's actually time to close the first talk and to thank Audrey again for the beautiful presentation. Actually, I don't find the clap hands button in this webinar, so I do it in real time. Right. Thank you very much. And let me introduce